Good evening. Good afternoon, good evening. I'm Ari Gordon. I'm chair of history at Amherst College, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at UMass Amherst. Today's event is a discussion of Justin Cammy's critical edition and translation of Abraham Sutzkever's From Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg, Memoir and Testimony. Sutzkever, the last great Yiddish poet, wrote his memoir about the Holocaust in Vilna in 1944, very shortly after his airlift to Moscow. It is then a rare historical document of an extraordinary timing and also of an extraordinary author. The book at hand includes not only Sutzkever's Vilna Ghetto memoir, but also his testimony at Nuremberg and quite a few related writings from his Moscow years in 1944, 1946. So with us today is Justin Cammy, who edited and translated the book. Justin is professor of Jewish Studies and World Literature at Smith College, currently in England as a visiting fellow at Clare Hall, University of Cambridge. A specialist in Yiddish literary and cultural history. He's the author of many articles on the interwar literary group Young Vilna, co-editor of Arguing the Modern Jewish Canon. His critical edition and translation of Sutzkever from the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg from 2021 was awarded multiple prizes, including the Levian Prize in Yiddish for Modern Language from the MLA, Modern Language Association, the Canadian Jewish Literary Award, and the I.J. Segal Award in Jewish Translation. Now, to discuss this outstanding book, we are also joined by our three panelists. Harriet Murav is the Catherine Bruce Bastian Professor of Global and Transnational Studies at the Center for Advanced Study, Professor in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature in the Program of Comparative and World Literature at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's the author of 6 monographs, 5 co-edited books, and numerous articles on Russian and Yiddish literature and culture from an interdisciplinary comparative perspective. Murav is also is a translator. She co-translated David Bergelson's Judgment in 2017. Her next book is The Dust of the Earth, Literature of Abandonment in Revolutionary Russia and Ukraine, is forthcoming with Indiana University Press 2024. We are also joined by Laura Yokush, who's the Albert Abramson Associate Professor of Holocaust Studies at Brandeis University. Her publications include the book Collect and Record, Jewish Holocaust Documentation in Early Post-War Europe, which was the winner of the National Jewish Book Awards for Holocaust. She's the co-editor of the volume Jewish Honor Codes and of Revenge and Retribution, Revenge, Retribution, Reconciliation, Justice and Emotion Between Conflict and Mediation, which is an anthology. And her current research explores Jewish conceptions of post-Holocaust justice and revenge during and after the Holocaust. Last but not least, we are joined by Jeffrey Grossman, Associate Professor and Chair of German Department and a member of the Jewish Studies Program at the University of Virginia. His research focuses on German and German Jewish literature and thought, Yiddish literature and translation of literature and knowledge. Beside his book, The Discourse on Yiddish, in Germany from the Enlightenment to the Second Empire, and a co-edited issue of the journal Quest devoted to German and Habsburg Jews during World War I. He has published various articles dealing with Heinrich Heine, Walter Benjamin, Franz Kafka, and memory among the émigré Central European intellectual. He's currently writing a book titled Jewish Self-Fashioning and Translating Yiddish, the Case of Germany and Austria, 1890 1939. So thank you all for being with us. The plan is going to be the following. Each of the panelists will have 10 to 12 minutes to comment on the book. By that point, we'll hand the floor to the author and the editor and the translator, Justin Cammy, to both respond and reflect on the process of writing the book. And in as much as time allows, and I believe that it will allow, we'll collect at that point also questions from our audience, and we'll field those as well. So without further ado, I yield the floor to Harriet Murav. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for this delightful opportunity to basically sit around and praise Justin for this wonderful critical edition. I want to note that I am not a Sutzkever expert or scholar. I met Justin when we were both at the Frankel Institute at the University of Michigan right before COVID started. So I want to begin with words of praise that I co-wrote when awarding this book the MLA Leviant Memorial Prize. While there are many Holocaust memoirs, Justin Cammy's translation of Vilna Ghetto by Abraham Sutzkever brings a particularly powerful and important account of the destruction of the Jewish community to English readers for the first time. The narrative combines Sutzkever's lyrical voice, which I'm going to come back to, with recollections and documentation of Nazi atrocities, Jewish deaths, and Jewish resilience. In addition to the compelling memoir, the collection also includes translations of Sutzkever's testimony and diary from the Nuremberg trials, which I consider crucially important, as well as reminiscences from his experience in Moscow in the mid-1940s, Justin's deft introductions to the different sections, his detailed, thoughtful afterword co-written with Avraham Noverstern, as well as the extensive footnotes, maps, photographs, chronology, bibliography of additional readings, and index of persons and place names, not to mention the inclusion of variant language signified by asterisks, makes this the absolute, touchstone for anyone interested in Sutzkever at this time period and these events. So I just have just now going to praise the book in a few other ways. So I think it's very difficult to translate a lyrical voice when the lyrical voice is describing murder and atrocity, and the emotional balance that Justin comments on that Sutzkever showed, I think is part of the historical milieu, and I want to get back to that as well. But when you open this book, it's just so shocking. When I turned on the radio the morning of the 22nd of June, a hysterical German scream leapt out at me like a pack of lizards. I mean, you don't know, you're immediately disoriented. What realm have I entered? And there are numerous other moments where Justin had to confront the lyrical, the poetic voice describing horror. The hanged victim, Asya, hanged by the Germans, swayed like a cornstalk. You again, it's disorienting and it's marvelous and it's horrifying. And I was reminded of something the great poet Caroline Forche said when she was traveling in El Salvador, and she wrote, I didn't know what was when she heard testimony about prison and atrocity, she said, I didn't know what was a metaphor and what was real. So if you are a Sutzkever, a reader of his poetry, there's a famous poem, I lie in a coffin, ich liege in an Ohren. And in here we have indeed how the poet lay in a coffin. So if you didn't know that, you might think that was a metaphor, but in fact it was a real experience. And this combination of real mimesis, representations of real experience, and metaphorical language is very difficult to cope with emotionally, and it's very difficult to know how to render in English or write about in a scholarly way when you're not sure what is metaphor and what is real experience. And I found this in my own work on dealing with poetry and prose written in response to the pogroms of the Russian Civil War. So the events that are narrated are familiar to those who know this history, which I am not. The impossible decisions, Wittenberg, for example, surrendering himself to the Gestapo, then the escape from the ghetto, the return to the ghetto, the discovery, the appalling, horrifying discovery of the murder of Sutzkever's infant son, the creation of the ghetto archive, the paper brigade, saving cultural treasures, and escape through the sewers, airlift to Moscow. I mean, I've just, condensed this incredibly dramatic events. And I think that one of Justin's important notes in the afterword is that this is a document not only that describes events, but also describes what could and could not be expressed at a particular time and place. And so whether this is something that could or could not be expressed, or whether this was Sutzkever, and it's so fascinating, is his own deliberate restraint. For example, once I recognized one of my mother's shoes on a wagon. That's all. That's it. There's nothing further. Or I am most pleased by the buildings that lie in ruins. Here he is in Berlin. Very infrequent mentions of himself and his own emotions and his own suffering. So different from our age of confession, right? There's practically no I about my suffering. I, Sutzkever, Panar, the beauty, my mother, my child, all of my friends at Panar. At the same time, no one is there. One of those lines that you could spend, pages and pages discussing, and I hope people are. And I want to juxtapose this to other voices at the time responding to the same events. So the Yiddish writer, Soviet writer Itzik Kipnis is in Kiev when the Soviets hang Germans and their collaborators. And Kipnis, not known for restraint, says that his heart danced at the sight of bodies being hanged. Now Sutzkever never says this. And I think that one of the important subtexts that Justin wrestled with, and that was the subject of explicit debate in the Soviet Union at this time, was how much emotional impact do we want? So Ehrenberg, who was the one that airlifted Sutzkever, as we know, was not the only editor of the ill-fated Black Book. Vasily Grossman, was also brought in, and they debated how to handle emotion. Do we want to have high impact, low impact? And it's interesting to me that given Sutzkever's restraint, Ehrenberg in these debates says more emotion, and Grossman says less emotion. And I want to relate that back to the parameters of atrocity testimony, going back to Jewish relief organizations working in the teens and 19 teens and 20s. The organizing commissions, the central committees of these Soviet-controlled and also not Soviet-controlled relief organizations did not want shock and horror in chronicles, in descriptions, in testimony. They thought that this would undermine the impact of what they were doing. And I have many times thought how different from today. And that's one of the things that Justin's marvelous book makes you think about, the larger implications of the shifting norms of testimony and credibility, incredulity, and that we bring to our evaluation of testimony. And one final thought, and this made me think about David Bergelson, because I didn't know, and it was a great revelation to me, that Sutzkever wanted to testify in Yiddish, but he couldn't, and he had to testify in Russian. And we know that Elie Wiesel talked about Yiddish as the great language of testimony, but really in the same period, in 1946, David Bergelson publishes a story called An Aidus, a Witness, in which an old man practically falling down, standing in the doorway of the building, is almost accosted by a younger woman and says, "Do you need something?" And he says, "I am a witness. You have to write down what I say." So she does. And the story is entirely in Yiddish. She writes it down, as she's writing it, she translates it into Russian. The whole story is Yiddish, right? So then she asks them every now and then, is this right? Is it right? And his answer is, I don't know. I can't tell you. The suffering was in Yiddish. So I'm just wondering if there's an unexplored interaction here between Bergelsen and Sutzkever on this very, very question. And my question therefore to Justin is, is it possible that we have Sutzkever's Yiddish original, the thing he wanted to say but didn't say? So that is, I think I'll leave it there with that question. And I just want to reiterate that this is a magnificent accomplishment. And I think it's a model and a touchstone for other translators that are going to now be held to this really, really high standard. So thank you, Justin.
Thanks so much, Harriet. And before we pass it on to Laura, I just want to remind our audience that if they have questions that they want to pose, please feel free to use the chat function. And now I pass it on to Laura.
Thank you, Adi, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Justin, for the invitation and for the opportunity to think together about this really impressive work and translation. So I also want to praise the translation and acknowledge the importance of that critical edition that you did, that makes Sutzkever's extraordinary memoir and the writings about Nuremberg and his testimony widely available and accessible to a broader audience. So a beautiful translation, well-informed notes and apparatus, and an excellent and very knowledgeable afterword that you co-authored with Abraham Noverstern. I was going to say Abraham Sutzkever, I'm sorry. Abraham Noverstern, which gives really the historical, cultural, and political and biographical background of these writings in a beautiful way. So I have 3 comments. The first point relates to Sutzkever's writings in how they fit the broader context of Jewish responses to the Holocaust in the immediate post-war period. And I really think that Sutzkever's Vilna Ghetto exemplifies this historical autobiographical writing that survivors during the immediate wake of the Holocaust began. And he belongs to this cohort that had a distinct mission to document the past, both in terms of their own experience, but more so to represent the fate of the Jewish collective. And so he belongs to this group of survivors who saw themselves basically fulfilling a mission to chronicle this enormous cataclysm and to write it into history and to public consciousness, so that the perpetrators would not also control the historical narrative, and the perpetrators would not also erase the memory of the victims and the traces of the crimes they committed, and to also destroy the memory of the culture and the life worlds that they had destroyed. So Sutzkever is part of these vast efforts, I think, of Jews after the liberation from Nazi rule to collect, salvage, testify, write, and publish materials about the Churban. And they fulfill multiple goals here, I think. First of all, they want to establish the facts, if you will. Then they want to give voice to the dead and also commemorate and mourn the dead through giving voice to them. They want to create archival repositories that enable future historical research. They are blueprinting, so to speak, the methods and approaches of how to research this catastrophe. And they also want to create evidence and to serve justice. And less explicitly, I think, they also find in this documentation work and writing a path to their own post-traumatic recovery, because it gives them a purpose and it gives a possibility to rationalize their own survival and to grapple with their own sense of guilt for having survived while loved ones had not. And so this speaking about the atrocities in the name of the dead gives a purpose. The survival wasn't accidental, but it was in order to fulfill this mission. So I think Sutzkever is really part of this larger quote unquote frenzy of writing and talking about the past that happened in the immediate post-war period, and yielded collections of thousands of survivor accounts. Philip Friedman speaks of 18,000 testimonies, survivor accounts, written accounts that were collected in the first decade and a half after the war. And there's, of course, hundreds of publications where this book really fits in. And the bibliography Guide to Jewish History Under Nazi Impact, compiled by Philip Friedman and Jacob Robinson, is really a testament to this prolific phase of writing where this fits in. And these writings and efforts have been only discovered in the last 2 decades, really, and they have contested the stereotype of silence, and shown that there were significant efforts by Jews to confront the past through writing, researching, commemoration, and the pursuit for justice immediately after the war. And I think that this work really is significant in this belated reckoning of these efforts, because first of all, it makes this very important example of early Jewish writing about the past available in a critical edition, and also because the critical edition kind of validates these early efforts and is part of this broader trend of scholarship. And my next point is about more about the style of his writing. So I look at it, of course, as a historian of the Holocaust and not as a literature person, not as a Yiddish anyone who's particularly knowledgeable in Yiddish literature. So forgive me if I kind of have this this blunt historian's lens. So he writes in a style of reportage, which is really fascinating to me. He has this, he's inspired by Ilya Ehrenburg's writings, but also other people, of course, who are writing at the same time about these atrocities, kind of have the same kind of style. For example, Rachel Auerbach with her Treblinka book also has a similar style in which there is personal observations and personal experiences and a personal narrative that's fused with documents and the voices of other witnesses. And as Harriet, you just said already, that it's not about Sutzkever, it's not really about his experiences. I completely agree with this. It's very interesting how he makes himself a medium through which other witnesses, other eyewitnesses speak. And at the same time, he also speaks through their words. And they give him a voice, and so there is this interaction, which is really interesting. And how he works with eyewitness accounts from other people, mostly, of course, from Jews, but not only from Jews. There's also Lithuanians and kind of local non-Jews who speak who get to speak. And I think he, to the point of the methodology, he really has interesting methodological approaches that have remained highly relevant for Holocaust studies. So this approach to local history, how the destruction actually played out on the ground in a local context, on a local level. His writing history from the bottom up, through the perspective of the victims. And he places the Jewish community or Jewish society at the center of this. He's writing from inside the Jewish community. And he highlights a broad variety of different responses: compliance, cooperation with Nazi authorities, evasion, escape, disbelief, betrayal, solidarity, resistance. He has cultural resistance, but also armed resistance. And he also addresses the rifts in inside the Jewish community that were the result of the persecution. And he, although he puts the Jews at the center, he also triangulates the actors in a way that it's not just about Jews, it's also about local non-Jews, it's also about Lithuanians who are collaborators, but they are also rescuers. And he does away with this bystander category in a very smart and really up-to-date way, in that he basically says that no one was just a bystander, everybody played an active role, and these roles were ambivalent, and they could be helping or they could be harming Jews. And then, of course, there are the Germans, and the Germans are very prominent. They are not faceless perpetrators. He names them very specifically, what their crimes are, what their names are, how they talk, what they say, etc. So it's an interesting view of a victim onto the German perpetrators. And so just to finish this point, I think his writing is really up to date with issues that have been really relevant for current scholarship in terms of the division of labor between German perpetrators and local perpetrators, Jewish behavior, local history, different forms of resistance, how to use testimony and ego documents, etc. And then I have something to say about the restraint, but I think I'd save that for the discussion, because I think it's really interesting that he doesn't seem to put all his emotions in this account, but that it was a restrained, kind of detached yet involved account. That he is not a historian, which I think gives him some flexibility and leeway. He doesn't have this whole problem of wanting to be objective that other people such as Philip Friedman or Josef Wolf or Leon Polyakov grappled with. How can I be involved emotionally and detached to be a scholar who approaches this subject? So he seems to have less of that inner turmoil about this, because it is not his it seems to me that this type of writing is not where his heart is. His heart is in his poetry. This is kind of his emotional valve. And then the last and third point, which will be shorter, is the interesting tension I wanted to relate to his testimony at Nuremberg. And I wanted to say that I'm very grateful that you included the testimony and the diary in this, because it really adds another layer. And the interesting to me is this tension in his work between revenge and justice, and between his personal urge for revenge in the sense of kind of paying back the injustice directly onto the perpetrator by harming the perpetrators, as opposed to a mediated form in which you rely on a court to follow rules to assess individual guilt of a perpetrator, and then you rely on a punishment that's proportional to the crime. And so I think it's really interesting that he has this constant expression of urges for revenge. There's this interesting story about the axe, where he engages with his own inner desires for taking revenge and then not taking revenge, actually. And he carries this forward through the narrative, and he has other witnesses who speak about revenge, and he kind of uses their language. But then, of course, he testifies, and he is, in a way, he has all the credentials to be the moral witness, to use Caroline Dean's term. He kind of does it all correctly. He raises everything that the Soviet prosecutors want him to raise. He speaks of the angel of language who put the right Russian words in his mouth, and he is kind of elated and euphoric about this testimony and saying Kaddish to the dead through the testimony. But then, of course, you give us the backstory in this, how frustrated he was that he couldn't speak Yiddish, and how he also says in his memoir, his diary, what is stronger, my sorrow or the desire for vengeance, after the testimony. And then to end this, I just wanted to mention that he also wrote a poem right after this his testimony, which I think is really interesting and we should discuss, because here he seems to be more doubtful that the trial can really do justice. And he raises this question for him, how can a trial, how can anyone do justice after genocide, after so horrifying a crime? What will justice look like after such a crime? And he's kind of exploring this inner tension of believing in divine justice or hoping for divine justice, and then critiquing God for actually not being able to do justice, and the Jewish people having to take matters into its own hand, so to speak. But he leaves open what that actually means. Thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Laura. And with this, we move to the comments of a third panelist, Jeffrey Grossman. Please. I think you're still muted.
Sorry, I forgot about that. First, I want to also thank Justin for inviting me, and I know Alon Confino was also involved with that, to thank Alon and Adi for hosting this, as well as the Institute for organizing it. Harriet and Laura have already touched on certain important things I wanted to touch on, but I want to just add to that a little bit and go in a slightly different direction at the same time. I agree with them both that the translation itself and the edition, as well as the translation, are really wonderful to have, and great for anybody who wants to study this, the Vilna Ghetto and the period, precisely because of the apparatus that you provide, in addition to the elegance of the translation. All the hundreds of footnotes, the chronicle of the Vilna Ghetto, the place names, all these things really help orient us, as does the afterword you and Avram Noverstein co-wrote. And there, I think, for instance, just to mention, to get mentioned here so that everybody hears about it, if those who don't know already, about the importance of Sutzkever's poem called Nidre, which is the poem that reached Moscow and prompted Ilya Ehrenberg and others to argue for his being removed and brought to Moscow, where he again read Kol Nidre, and what a powerful event that was, bringing attention to what was happening in Vilna and among the partisans. So that these kinds of details that give us this background, and this is just one of many that you guys provide, that you and Avram provide, I think are really helpful for reading the diary. If it weren't, it just rounds out so much. Another example is just when you're talking about the paper brigade, right? There's the Rosenberg task force, the Alfred Rosenberg task force, where they were supposed to be sent, taking these cultural treasures of Jewish life and sending them off to Germany or destroying them, for the museum about the history of the people, the Jewish people after they'd been annihilated, and also destroying others, and how they smuggled many of these out as hid them in various places. And you give this footnote on page 106 where Sutzkever refers to the work of hiding Vilna's cultural treasures, and he mentions Zeli Kalmanovich, Hermann Kruk, Shmerka Kazadzinsky, Rochel Krinsky, and others. And some of these are more well-known figures, Kalmanovich, Kruk, Kazadzinsky, but just the clarification about who people are, to get the sense of the history and who the different individuals were involved with, that these names are remembered. So in that sense, very much this act of memory and remembrance. Also, Laura was mentioning the Nuremberg diary, as did Harriet, and I was aware of the fact that he had wanted to speak in Yiddish, that there was no Yiddish interpreter made available for him, and that this was very frustrating to him. What I was not as aware of was his own concern in the lead up, once he had already arrived in Germany, in the lead up, that whether he was actually going to be allowed to speak, whether he was going to be among the 5 chosen speakers, as well as his commentaries on the speakers. All right, so quite interesting to read there. also his other motivation in speaking, on the one hand, to bear witness to what happened, to the violence, the killing, but also, he says, to make clear the survival, that this Jewish world, that there's some element of it that survives with him. And I think that plays into his desire to speak in Yiddish, apart from his own concerns about his Russian. And a lot of the book, the memoir itself, seems to me to be also about that, about the role of culture and creativity in Jewish life, and how that has preserved that effort to preserve East European Jewish life. And I think here about the Benjamin Harshav's introduction to Hermann Kruk's diary in the translation, and he talks about the two Holocausts. One is the Holocaust of the actual people, the killing off of the people, and the other is the destruction of Jewish culture and life in Eastern Europe. It never recovered in the same way. And in going into the cultural aspect and the creativity, again, you and Avram mentioned the problem of that those acts of cultural preservation, the paper brigade, on the one hand, attesting to a kind of resistance, but when confronted with machine guns, only can do so much. And here I'm reminded of Amos Goldberg's comments in his book on trauma in first person and about diary writing during the Holocaust. And Amos Goldberg begins already in his preface, and he's citing another memoirist, intellectual Joseph Tselkovich, who talks about the quote from Tselkovich reads, "It is not only the external form of life that has changed in the ghetto, it is not only the clothing that has come to look tattered and the faces to wear masks of death, but the entire Jewish trend of thought has been totally transformed under the pressure of the ghetto. The ghetto, the great negator of the civilization and progress that people nurtured for centuries, has swiftly obliterated the boundaries between sanctity and indignity, just as it obliterated the boundaries between mine and yours, permitted and forbidden, fair and unfair." And Amos Goldberg goes on to talk about how life stories that are part of narratives, memoirs, how shattered these become. The individual's self and identity are also shattered, so that we don't have that strict preservation, solely about preservation. It seems to me that in Sutzkever's memoir, and I think on some level Harriet touches on this when she talks about your quotations of those devastating passages that are, on the one hand, almost matter of fact and yet poetic at the same time, because this is not this kind of subjective expressions that come through much more in his poetry in general, but his reportage, and there the Nuremberg influence is important. That this constant tension there between the desire to be creative, the need to be creative as a way of a form of self-preservation, and also to preserve culture as a form of self-preservation, even as a source of hope, as a source of cultural salvation, and how it runs up against the opposite, this disintegration. There's this wonderful point where he talks about the artist Zalman Bach, the 9-year-old artist Zalman Bach, who he says whose maturity exceeds many adults who've seen so much, who asks him upon meeting him about what is expressionism, and he says, and he's amazed by his drawings. Bach would go on to become a very famous artist, important artist. And he says, "That evening, I was introduced to a new phenomenon that was unlike any other I had previously encountered in the ghetto," and Zalman Bach. He spent entire days drawing, including the winter when the cold froze his delicate fingers while he sketched in a corner, and how he had seen through, when he was in hiding, he'd seen through slats in an attic. people being deported and murdered. And this feeds in, and he responds by turning to drawing. He gives another example of the composer Rivela Bernstein, sorry, my Americanization coming in there. How she, let's see if I had the page somewhere. Yeah, page 129, I believe it is, at the bottom. He describes her. He says, the arts thrived underground. The composer Bernstein spent half a year in the sewers before she found a corner for herself in a nearby melina, or hiding place. She hid in a little well shaft underneath Hotel Europa. For days on end, she would listen to the splashing of mice in the water and her unusual sounds echoing in the cavernous sewers. Pieces of glass, tin cans, and stones also floated by in the water. When combined with the sounds of mice, these objects all came together in a kind of harmony for the musician, who was inspired to compose a piece there in the sewers. And then he does something, it's shocking in its own way, but it is contrasting this with Nazi responses to culture. And 3 pages later, he's talking about the Nazi officer Bruno Kittel, who's fairly young still, and is trained as a musician, and how while they're liquidating the Vilna Ghetto, he has a piano brought out into the midst and is playing the piano as Jew snatchers are discovering Jews and dragging out people. And one young man who was crying and begged him to spare his life. When he saw Kittel at the piano, he fell at his feet. Kittel drew his pistol. With one hand, he shot the youngster, and with the other, he kept on playing. It's this contrast of culture in the service of destruction, or made a mockery of, in a sense, and the turning around of devastating experience into something that generates some possible hope for those who are those suffering, the victims. And since, because of time limits, I won't go into further, but there's also bearing the reports that Laura was talking about, how he gives these constant reports of others, and his own voice, I think, is there, but it's also there as the person conducting reportage. And it's the instance of, he talks about people, the collective moments where there's a kind of a collective loss of mind, losing of one's mind, and this horrific situation of the 9-year-old child telling about how his parents end up being killed while in hiding by other Jews in hiding because they're afraid of the noise that's going to reveal where they're hidden. And I won't read through the scene, it's too horrific anyway. But this constant tension there about the role of culture, of creativity as a way to respond to this destructive, the destruction, the annihilation, or the effort to survive. And this constant potential of just disintegrating, of losing one's sense of self. And again, I think the translation, the way you translated it, just brings that through so elegantly. And I'll stop there and let you have a chance to talk before time's up.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And before I give the floor to Justin, I just want to remind our attendees, our audience, to use the Q&A feature in the Zoom to field questions, both to the panelists, to all the panelists, to Justin and the rest of the panelists. And Justin, what I imagine in the next couple of minutes is both, if you could, there were so many big questions, big points made in the comments. Obviously, we don't have enough time for all of those, but if you could both respond to some of them, and share with us a little bit of the process of writing this book, or coming to translate the book and create the book. I also am tempted to use my position in the mic to squeeze a sort of a question of my own, but don't feel like you have to necessarily to respond to it here. And that is, Sutzkever had quite a bit of life ahead of him after given the testimony, after writing the Ghetto Vilna, and I'm curious to what extent and where did he curate, edit, revisit the presentation, the way he presented his experiences in the Ghetto Vilna. And as you remember, Laura mentioned how up to date all of this is, but I'm curious if to his mind things were up to date. So with this, the floor is yours. I think 15, 20 minutes is definitely a good time, and then we'll collect some Q&As.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. I want to thank the Institute for Holocaust Genocide and Memory Studies at UMass, especially Alon Confino, for proposing this panel, and for Harriet, Laura, and Jeffrey, and Adi for agreeing to join us at very short notice. When presenting the opportunity to propose panelists to Alon, I thought it would be beneficial to see how those trained in Slavic studies or German studies, translation studies, or Holocaust history might approach this text and its context and the challenges of translation in ways that perhaps my ordinary crowd of Yiddish literature scholars may not. And they all really step forward enthusiastically. So thank you. I'm very grateful for your comments and for your observations. Perhaps I should begin with some of the decision-making that went into the translation and editorial process. We need to remember that Abraham Sutzkever was in his early 30s when he started to pen this work, only weeks after he was rescued from the partisan forest, where he had spent 6 months of autumn and winter, which followed 2 full years in the Vilna Ghetto. So it's the work of a man with deep experience of early success as a poet in the interwar period, of personal loss, of communal destruction, of war, but despite all that experience, a man with no previous interest in writing prose. Two different versions of Sutzkever's memoir were published in 1946, about a year and a half after it was first solicited by the Literary Committee of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee and its Black Book Project, which itself was intended to provide evidence of fascist crimes against the Jews and establish the Jewish role in the fight against fascism. These published versions are similar, but not exactly the same, and I wanted to produce a synthetic translation that included the full text of both versions, the one published by Amherst Press in Moscow, which would have needed to get the approval of the censor, and the one published by the Association of Vilna Natives in France. And no previous translations had attempted to do this, neither the German nor the two Hebrew translations, the Russian translation, the French translation. And I thought perhaps we might be able to learn something about how the content of the work was shaped by its environment and editorial expectations. And in that sense, it's now the most complete version available. As several of you have alluded, I also sought to put the memoir into conversation with two other texts that were part of Sutzkever's testimonial work at the same time. That's the transcript of the testimony at Nuremberg and his diary notes about that experience that he didn't publish until several decades later. I thought that all three could complement one another, but not be repetitive, since each is written in an entirely different mode. And then, I should have stopped, but then it occurred to me that several essays by Sutzkever about his encounter with Jewish and Yiddish writers in the Soviet Union could provide a further window into this period in which he was drafting and editing the memoir. And that's when I chose three writers to focus on three essays that he wrote, one on the Soviet Jewish writer Ehrenburg, one on the Yiddish modernist poet Markish, and one on the Yiddish theater director Michols, that provide us with a sense of the environment of Sutzkever's composition. And these intimate portraits reveal Sutzkever's personal admiration for those who would welcome him and his wife to Moscow, and who continued to test the limits of Yiddish self-expression under the very watchful eyes of the authorities and, unfortunately, in some cases, the watchful eyes of one another. That many of his friends in Moscow would themselves be betrayed by Stalinism situates, I think, the memoir precisely at a moment in which Sutzkever was reflecting back at the monstrosity of fascism while living under a different totalitarian moment. And the essays reveal the pressure to satisfy his rescuers and his colleagues, his inability to ultimately conform to that environment, and the corrosive effects of censorship and self-censorship on the creative psyche. So in that sense, the volume became more ambitious than just a translation of a memoir. It became an attempt to provide perspective on a discrete period in a major Yiddish writer's life that we might call Sutzkever's Moscow years, which really were only 2 years. Now, the project was also inspired by 2 courses I teach at Smith and also co-taught with Adi at Amherst College, one on Holocaust history and one on Holocaust literature. And I also believe that as scholars, we have a responsibility to create new sources for our students and to introduce writers who might not otherwise be accessible to an even broader community. And this is especially true in the field of Yiddish. Though the majority of Holocaust victims were Yiddish speakers, the majority of texts used by the first generation of scholars to craft historical narratives of the Holocaust or to put together syllabi on Holocaust literature did not draw sufficiently on Yiddish source materials. So this translation was also an intervention of sorts. Sutzkever writes at one point, "The power and the wonder of the Yiddish language revealed themselves to me above all in the ghetto." And I thought that this might be a revelation to be shared a little bit more broadly. And this point also influenced my decision as a translator, since Sutzkever wrote this book for a Yiddish-speaking readership at a moment in history where Yiddish place names had been wiped off the map. I sought to produce a translation that respected the city's Yiddish toponymies. It's important to remember that Jewish geography isn't only about material space, but also about political claims, about psychic conditions that are registered in language. So in order to provide a sense of the way Sutzkever and his fellow Vilna natives navigated when they were still alive, and then reconstructed a Yiddish Vilna, I elected to retain Sutzkever's Yiddish names for most streets and neighborhoods and locations. And although some scholars and translators have used official pre-war names when writing about wartime Vilna, I found that to be anachronistic for a period when the city was no longer under Polish control. And to use contemporary Lithuanian names, although perhaps easier for readers who are in Lithuania today if they brought the book with them, seemed to me equally problematic. Sutzkever's Yiddish place names remind us of how he consciously deployed Yiddish to claim urban space for Jewish collective memory. And my decision to retain those names for both places and people reflected and aided my own process of reconstructing in some small way that Yiddish environment, or what we might call Sutzkever's visceral memoryscape. Finally, I was really motivated here by a central problem in Sutzkever studies. Until now, scholars have paid scant attention to this text, despite Sutzkever's reputation as the most important Yiddish poet witness to what would later become known as the Holocaust, and despite his standing as the leading figure of the post-war period of Yiddish letters, it played no significant role in discussions of the author's oeuvre. One could even claim or go so far as to say that Sutzkever himself erased his own memoir from public memory through its purposeful neglect. He never sought out its republication or its translation after it was translated very, very early on into Hebrew and French. And by ignoring it, he seemed to suggest that either it was unimportant or that everything of value he had to say about that period he had poured into his lyrics and later into his symbolic prose and anthologies. So really, this was a problem for me. One would assume that the only chronicle written by one of the most important Yiddish poets to emerge from the Vilna Ghetto would figure prominently in scholarship about him. How to explain that obscurity? And just to give a little bit more about the backstory, and then we can move to discussion. When I approached several colleagues about my interest in publishing a translation of this chronicle more than a decade ago, I was greeted with real skepticism about the value of the project. And I think two critiques came out most prominently. One, more than one colleague suggested that the memoir was politically compromised due to the fact that it was solicited and composed and published in the Soviet Union. And those skeptics volunteered, to what extent could this book really be taken seriously when written by a writer eager to satisfy his rescuers and to secure his new position in Moscow? And then they would add, with all that we know now about Vilna, why offer up a text limited in perspective, which makes mistakes in some places with fact, which is composed under the threat of the censor, but rather, I think, than give in to that Cold War management of Sutzkever's reputation, my goal was to tackle it head on in some ways. And the next real qualm or hesitation that was suggested to me was that Sutzkever really was forced or felt compelled to take a detour into prose in order to serve the expectations of his hosts, even though it wasn't his literary priority. And this then led to the second worry that in translating the memoir for a wider audience, we might diminish Sutzkever's reputation as a writer, especially as a poet, because it exists in artistic tension and maybe undercuts in some ways what he had so meticulously constructed in his poetry. These people who were very familiar with his style seemed to be bothered by the seemingly journalistic accounting of his experiences, with the spare prose, with the breathless haste in which it was written. The argument has always been that his poetry communicates so much more experience than his actual memoir. So why bother replicating it when everything else is already there? And to go back, that he never promoted it in his work later suggests that perhaps the writer himself had disassociated from it. None of these explanations seem to be particularly convincing to me. If anything, they helped to problematize and make the text more interesting to work on. And in the end, I reminded myself and hopefully my readers that we have a responsibility to evaluate the Chronicle for what it is rather than for what it is not, and on its own aesthetic terms. What we may see as an aesthetic of absence and self-restraint is an aesthetic that has its own power and that it responds to a particular reality, where we may desire background information that directly informs his most famous ghetto poems or more of his inner emotion or psychic trauma. When he provides us instead with the collective voice and only rarely a glimpse into the self, says something about what he felt his duty and responsibilities were. So I think all memoir is a construction of the self at a particular moment and should be unpacked as such. If Sutzkever's poetry, I think I wrote at one point, served the angels of art, then his memoir serves a different host, though perhaps no less than a host. So that's where I, wanted to make some remarks to sort of correspond to your very, very generous and thoughtful insights. And Adi, how do you want to proceed? Do you want to have a discussion? Do you want me to see if I can address any? I know that Harriet had one big question, and that was about the Yiddish original. And I also see that Nancy Sinkoff in the Q&A asked about, what are my biggest regrets about the translation, or where do I see that I erred? So I think that in any project, you capture mistakes. And what's been so fascinating is that there's a Lithuanian translation now being produced that's based on this edition. But the Lithuanian translation is going to use the apparatus and the notes and sort of translating both texts simultaneously, but it goes back to the Yiddish original. And what we've discovered is, of course, there are mistakes in translation, mistakes in dating, and those are things that need to be corrected. And although it pains me that there's even one mistake, they do exist. As for the Yiddish original, that may be another interesting question. There are typescripts of this in the Russian archives, including with pencil line strikeouts by what we assume is the editor. They're not necessarily the entirety of the manuscript, but they are, there's a good part of them. That seemed to me to be beyond what I was able to do. I really wanted to produce a translation of the actual published documents. I didn't want to do a critical edition that was so critical that it looked at variants. But that's there for others who want to do that, so that we don't have his handwriting, but we do have those typescripts that would have been typed up at the time. In terms of other points that Laura makes, now that you mentioned the poem that he wrote about Nuremberg, that would have been a very interesting addition to put into the book as well. The more you dig around, the more you see how this could grow. And I've benefited so much. I just finished reading one of your works, Laura, and what occurs to me is when you talk about this being produced at a moment when so much else is going on, how what the writing that is being done in the Soviet Union is so similar, and at the same time is not so similar than perhaps the writing that's being done in the DP camps at the same moment. That is, there are similarities, but whether the conditions allow for the same type of writing entirely seems to be something that could be interrogated further. And then we have Adi's comment about where did he curate, or how did he curate these experiences, right? I don't know. I mean, and you're talking about after the fact, right? So one of the other really interesting moments came when I presented this research in a very preliminary moment at Yad Vashem. And one of the people in the audience, as you know, the Israeli academic environment may be different in tone than what we're used to in the United States, just started to scream at me in the audience, saying, why are you even bothering with this? You're only trying to take the light away from Abba Kovner. Everyone knows that Kovner is the hero of the Vilna Ghetto. Why do you Yiddishists always have to have your own heroes? Sutzkever himself is a myth maker, a self-aggrandizer. If anything, he sat in Yivo while everyone else was doing work and wrote his own poems. And like, really, come on, this is a nothing of a project. I'm hoping that it's been proved wrong, but in one point, I think we do need to acknowledge that Sutzkever was a myth maker. And one of the things that are very difficult to determine are when as a poet, he writes in a way that perhaps is based on actual things that happen, but then is embellished. And that has become part of his curatorial project. It's not that he was part of, this project of testimonial exchange where he became the address, the synthesizer, and then the disseminator of the voices and testimony of others, but also that he consciously crafted himself into that position. So these are all, ways of reminding ourselves that although the text is interesting and fascinating on its own terms, it's certainly a product of a particular moment. It was written with a slight bit of perspective, but not much, and written to serve certain goals, and also written to get done with. I mean, I think that's another aspect that informs the pace of it. Really, he wanted to get this done because he had to get it done so that he'd go back to editing his poems, which was what he really wanted to do, and get to work on writing a new epic poem. So the fact that the prose was sort of intervened in what he really wanted to do is also a really interesting thing to consider. What do we do with a document that sort of seems so important and so exciting and so interesting in many ways, but in part may have been even something, may have been an annoyance for the writer who felt obliged to do it, who felt that they had to respond and offer this testimony and evidence, but had other things or other modes that they thought perhaps were more important.
Justin, I noticed three versions of a similar questions repeated in the Q&As by Nancy Sinkop, Daniel Gordon, and Avinoam Pat, and all three seem to be raising the question of what can we learn from this text in various fields. So one is intrigued of how do we read Sutzkever's poetry differently, or his fiction writing differently based on that. The other asks, what can we learn about the Nazi system of power based on this document? And yet another asks if you were able to share through that text or diary, witness, or poetry with scholars of other people's historical suffering. In other words, what is the universal element or lessons or relevance of Sutzkever? So in a way, a similar question regarding the multiple.
Maybe I'll answer one of those and then allow
Sure.
others to jump in if they have thoughts. So the one about the poetry itself, I thought.
Not lessons, by the way. I'm correct.
No. I thought that by translating this chronicle or memoir, we would learn more about his poetry. That was the immediate initial push, right? Oh, we have his famous poem about the lead plates of the Rome press. Well, now we have the background to that. What we learn is that not only does he not write about his own poems, he only cites 2 poems in the entire memoir. Neither of them are his most famous poems, but the poems that we know come out of certain moments, either the prose there is so flat that he provides that the poetry gives you more information or experience than the prose memoir, when you'd expect it to maybe be at least equal, if not the opposite. And in some cases, you realize that the poems are not even based on the historical realities. So, for instance, we know that the Rome press poem about melting down the plates of the famous Rome press that printed the Vilna Talmud to use as bullets to defend the Vilna Ghetto is a complete fabrication, right? It just doesn't happen. On the other hand, we've been taught by scholars of Holocaust literature that perhaps the truth of that poem is more important than its historicity. So what are we supposed to do? Holocaust historians might come at it one way, and literary scholars might read the same incident an entirely different way. But maybe since we have this distinguished panel, others want to jump in on one or more of these questions.
Please.
I want to say that every time I think we have a reaction to something that isn't emotional enough, isn't informative enough, or is ahistorical, we have to stop and say, what am I expecting? So what norms am I bringing? And what are the ways in which the writer's own time and place set up demands that we just haven't acknowledged yet? I mean, I think you're right to point out Holocaust historians talking about the truth of testimony, even if the detail is wrong, and so forth. I think we always make demands on writers as if we have like a right to. I want emotion. I want information. I want background. You're not giving it to me. And I think then we have to shift and say, what did they think they were doing? How did they think they were expressing what they needed or wanted to express, given the time and place, as you, Justin, emphasized repeatedly? It's very important to question our own demands, I think, and measure them against the demands of our age of total confession, full emotion, which was just not the norm. It wasn't the norm in the 40s. It wasn't the norm in the 20s. It wasn't a norm in the teens. That's one point. And the other point I want to make, which is a little bit of I don't think it's necessarily accurate to say that the moment that Sutzkever wrote what he wrote in Moscow, the censor was breathing down his neck and everything was hyper-controlled. After all, a few years later, Michoels and Bergelsen were going to stage Prince Ruveni on the Moscow stage of the Yiddish Art Theater, which is about the ways in which the Holocaust is a repetition of the Spanish Inquisition and the way that Shlomo Molcho was going to rescue the Jews. I mean, it was a Kabbalistic play. So at this moment, yes, it ended, in 1948 with the arrests, but this moment, Jews were writing Jewishly about history from a Jewish perspective in Yiddish in Moscow.
Yeah, just to add to Harriet's point about the truth of the poem, about the Rome press, Dominic Capra has this very well-known article about the problem when historians criticize oral testimony, use of oral testimony to understand what happened during the Holocaust. And the example is of a woman who testifies to the power of the experience in Auschwitz when 3 crematoria were blown up. And it's known that only one of them was actually blown up, and said, so you can't rely on this testimony. He turns around and says, maybe the way to think about this is, what did she experience? when even one was blown up, that it had the impact as if it were three. And so it seems to me that when you think about the poem about the Rome press and the bullets, this famous poem, that just the fact of creating the bullets after the press has been destroyed, maybe that's in itself somehow this experience of transformation that Sutzkever is trying to bring across. And maybe a certain amount of myth making because it makes for a good poem, but maybe there's something additional going on there as well, just the emotional impact of that.
Absolutely. And I think to Harriet's point, you're right. Other than the fact that we know that Sutzkever was forced to or had certain things removed from the memoir itself because of the censors. So absolutely, you're right that Jews were writing as Jews, and he was asked to write as a Jew. The whole Black Book project was a Jewish project in some way, in totality, but he had to be conscious about what he could say and at least how he said it, not because he feared necessarily for his life at that moment, but because he knew that there are certain expectations that needed to be made. And also the pressures of, as you say, of the confessional moment that we're used to not being necessarily the mode that was there. There's a moment in a new movie about Sutzkever where even he talks about not revealing everything, or only revealing things that he was comfortable revealing. There's so much that he never wrote or that he never said, and so much that he might have said had he been able to say it. So for instance, the de-emphasis in the memoir on Lithuanian collaborators and the attention to Lithuanian helpers and rescuers clearly was a response to the moment that he was in. So I think we agree probably more than we disagree on this.
Absolutely. And in terms of what can we kind of extrapolate from this for the study of other genocides, I think I would say that, first of all, methodologically, I think the local context and the individual access to history through a first-person narrative that makes use of testimony it provides us with a lot of knowledge about how victims experience genocide, and how the writing about this is also a form of reckoning with the loss, and how it's in some way creating knowledge and awareness of what was going on, but it's also a form of kind of cultural continuity and kind of a form of post-traumatic reconstruction of some sort of the individual who's writing. And I think that is something that is a useful tool to study genocides in general. And I think we can use this as a case study, and we can look at, I don't know, Armenian writings about genocide, or Rwandan writings about genocide, and look at those. How do individuals talk about their experiences in local contexts, and how do they talk about, for example, the perpetrators and the quote-unquote bystanders, and people who have ambivalent roles in helping as the perpetrators as well as the victims, etc. So I think it offers a lot that makes a strong case for local level perspectives.
Good. We're getting close to time, so I think maybe that will be a good point to thank the Institute for Holocaust Genocide Memory Studies for hosting the event, especially Alon Confino, to thank all of our panelists, Jeffrey Grossman, Laura Yokush, Harriet Murav, and to thank Justin Cammy. And again, have a nice evening and good night, wherever you be. Thank you.
Thank you.